All right, hello and welcome to the urinary system. Let's get started. So the main parts of the urinary system are the kidneys, right, located probably higher than you would actually imagine them to be in the body. The ureters, which will carry the urine that is being formed from the kidneys down to the bladder. And then the urethra will take the urine from the bladder out the body. We'll talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail in this lecture. The function of the urinary system is to filter the blood. That is really, really important. I know a lot of times we think of the liver as being a main filter organ, but so are our kidneys, right? So as there are waste products being produced by cells, just in the regular metabolism, or just even sometimes the medications that we may take or supplements we may take, it's going to be the job of the kidneys to constantly filter our urine and make sure that it is free of waste as much as possible. So again, it's eliminating waste products, and it's also making sure that we have the right solute concentration in our bloodstream. So that also means the right levels of water in our bloodstream, not just for the importance of our electrolyte balance, but also to maintain our blood pressure. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in this lecture, as well as you'll hear about that in the next lecture as well. Okay, so again, where are these kidneys located? So they are, first of all, they're located retroperitoneally. So again, retroperitoneal simply means it is behind the peritoneum. So in this image, what you're looking at is a transverse section, and you're looking at it from below. So if you cut someone in half, like an upper and lower half, and then you lifted that torso up above your head and you're peering upward, that is what you're seeing right here. So this is anterior, posterior view. This is actually right and left, because again, we're looking up. So you have to it's a little bit, you got to turn around in your mind, I guess. Anyway, so here is your right kidney, left kidney, and then you can see here's a peritoneum, so they're located behind that peritoneum. So you'll notice they're actually fairly close to our vertebra. And in this one, you'll see this is the L2 vertebra. There is something, a part of the anatomy of the kidney called the hilus. So let me just go back to this image, it's a little bit easier. This part right here is going to be the hilus of the kidney. That is simply where the vessels and nerves enter and exit. That term hilus is preserved fairly well in anatomy for a number of different organs that have blood vessels and nerves entering and leaving at the same point. That space where that is occurring is simply called the hilus. There is a capsule that is going to surround the kidney. I don't know how well you can see in this image, but there is again a capsule. It is a connective tissue. It's transparent. You can see through it. It helps give the kidney its shape. And then you'll notice in this image there's lots of fat surrounding both kidneys. And that helps protect the kidneys from trauma. So if you get kind of kicked in the back or hit in the back or just fall and land wrong, it helps protect those kidneys from shock and things like that. All right, so let's take a more formal look at the functions of the kidneys. Again, it's going to help regulate blood ionic composition. So these are your electrolyte levels, so particularly your sodium, potassium, some of the calcium, as well as chloride levels. Those are the big ones. It will help regulate blood pH. This will be through the secretion or the reabsorption of either hydrogen ions or bicarbonate ions, depending on what the situation may be. The kidneys help regulate blood volume, and by regulating blood volume, they're going to regulate blood pressure. We'll talk a little bit more about the renin-angiotensin system, especially in the next lecture. They help maintain blood osmolarity. Again, that's our concentration. They will produce hormones. So we've already talked about renin. They help regulate blood glucose level. They can release glucose into the bloodstream via a process called gluconeogenesis. We won't go into the many steps of that. Just be aware of that term. And then, as I mentioned just a moment ago, it helps excrete waste and other foreign substances like vitamins or any kind of medications, excess medications that you may be taking. Now, as we take a look at the internal anatomy of the kidney, well, let me just back up one moment. You'll notice here again, there's that term hilus. Hilum is just singular. So that's just this area right here where you see these blood vessels entering and leaving, as well as this ureter leaving the kidney. Okay, so blood is going to enter into the kidney via the renal artery. And we'll see in the next slide how that gets dispersed. It'll go from this larger artery, and you're already seeing some branching here. As you can imagine, it's going to branch and branch into smaller and smaller blood vessels. But just some regional terms. So again, this outer layer, you'll see it's not very thick. This is that renal capsule. This first section here is the renal cortex. That's all of it around here. This inner portion is the medulla. So again, we have, that term should be fairly familiar to you. A lot of our organs have a cortex, a cortical area, maybe I should say it that way, and then a medullary area, so cortex and medulla. You'll notice, very conspicuous here, we have these sort of triangular shaped structures in the kidney. That is not an artifact. They do look like that. Those are called renal pyramids. In between those triangular shaped areas are more pale shaped areas. Those are called renal columns. And we'll see there's different things that are located in these pyramids and columns. We will have, let's see what else. There are these spaces called sinuses. They are not empty. They're normally filled with adipose or fat tissue. And then you'll notice there's something called a nephron here. We're going to talk quite a bit about the nephron, as well as this thing called the collecting duct. But basically, urine is being formed in this nephron, and it kind of drips down this collecting duct, and then it's caught by this minor calyx, which flows into a major calyx, which flows into this renal pelvis area until it goes to the ureter, to the urinary bladder. So you can see the path of urine drainage outlined here pretty clearly. Oops, sorry, skipped a slide. Let's talk a little bit about the blood flow. So here's a very similar image to the one we just saw, but now the blood vessels are more prominent. So what we're going to see is somewhat of a mirror-like structure between the arteries and the veins, as well as their naming is going to be almost exactly the same. So we are going to go from a renal artery to where it splits to a segmental artery, to this area in here in the renal columns where it's an interlobar artery, to this area where it's going over sort of the base of that renal pyramid where it's arcing. It's called the arcuate artery. Then you'll notice there's some of these branches that are going into the renal cortex area. Those are interlobular arteries. These interlobular arteries will form, and I'm going to move up to this image, will form this afferent arteriole, which will go into this little ball-like capillary called the glomerulus, or glomerular capillaries. It leaves as an efferent arteriole. That efferent arteriole will branch to form peritubular capillaries, as well as something called the vasa recta. Those are in slightly different portions of the nephron, but ultimately they will come together into an interlobular vein, which then goes into an arcuate vein, into an interlobar vein, into a segmental vein, into the renal vein. So you'll notice that basically, like cutting out this portion, you have interlobular artery, interlobular vein, arcuate artery, arcuate vein, interlobar artery, interlobar vein, segmental artery, segmental vein, renal artery, renal vein. So the arteries and veins in the cortex, here in the arc, and here in the renal column, here in this section here, as well as here, they all have the same names. So it just depends on where you are. Here it's renal, segmental, arcuate, segmental, interlobar, arcuate, interlobular. So those are not the same. They are spelled very similar, but like interlobular. There's 2 extra letters. This is going to be one part in a lab quiz where it will be very important that you get that spelling correct, because those are 2 different blood vessels. But otherwise, the names are identical. Okay, and this diagram will show you the pathway that blood is going to flow through the kidney. All right, the nephron then, which is what you're seeing here in yellow, that is the functional unit of the kidney. So this is what is doing the work. So again, here we're seeing an interlobular artery, which branches into an afferent arteriole. This ball-like capillary is the glomerulus, and then we're leaving via the efferent arteriole. And then we have all the vasorecta and paratubular capillaries. This diagram here labels them all as paratubular capillaries, but it's more correct to call these down here the vasorecta, and then the blood vessels up here, the paratubular capillaries. Okay, each kidney has about 1 million of these nephrons, 1 million of this setup, and I mean, which is frankly amazing, right? They extend from the cortical region, and that's what you're seeing here, from the cortical region, and part of it will extend down into the medullary area. And again, there's this tubular component, which is in yellow, and then there's also blood vessels that are closely associated with it, because as this nephron is filtering blood, filtering fluids from the bloodstream, so things are moving from that glomerulus into these tubes, you're going to make adjustments along the way. So things are going to move back out from the tubes back into the blood vessels, because you might want to conserve water, or you might want to conserve salt, or maybe you filtered glucose, right? So these are things that you'd want to conserve and put back into your bloodstream. So you want to reabsorb them. And then some things didn't get filtered in the first place. So you may want to make adjustments and make sure that they do go into the urine. One of the reasons why something may not get filtered here in the glomerular level, it's just too large to get through this little membrane that's in there, and we'll see that in a moment. So you have to actively insert it into these tubes somewhere along this pathway. Okay, so this is just another way to look at everything I just told you. So the parts of a nephron, again, there's the vascular component, the blood vessel portion, and then the tubular component. So the glomerular capsule is just that. It will be that ball-like thing surrounding the glomerulus. Then there's something called the proximal convoluted tubule, which you see in this image in blue. There is this loop of Henle. It has a descending limb, so the part that goes down, as well as an ascending limb, the part that goes up. Then there is a distal convoluted tubule that you're seeing up here, kind of squiggly and in green. Even though the distal and proximal are like right next to one another, the naming convention is similar to like distal and proximal, like on your arms. So proximal, like on your arm, being closer to the shoulder or the point of attachment to the torso. Similarly, the tube where it's closer to the attachment of the Bowman's capsule is proximal, and then as you've gone now farther away, that is now distal. And then this will all collect into this collecting duct. You may see this term come up, renal corpuscle. That is simply that glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus together. So both the blood vessel as well as the tubular capsule around it is called the renal corpuscle. So focusing in on the glomerulus, so again, that's the capillary part. What you'll notice, I think kind of maybe a little bit in this image, definitely in the next one, is that it has these slits in it. So as blood is flowing through the afferent arteriole, some of the fluid is in certain material will filter out of it and is caught by this Bowman's capsule. So I think of it, and I like this colander that I found, and I wish I could actually find that colander because it looks very nifty. But basically, like anything that's large, like your red blood cells, do not get filtered out of the glomerulus, out of the capillary bed. They stay there. So that's our little strawberries. However, fluids do, and maybe dirt particles in the case of strawberries, but otherwise wastes in the case of our bloodstream are small enough to get through these slits and are filtered in that colander-like glomerulus. And much like our sink catches all of this fluid, the Bowman's capsule or the glomerular capsule will capture that, and again, we'll take it down that complex tubule network, that's the nephron, for any adjustments that may need to be made. Okay, so staying here at the level of the glomerulus, the the walls of this blood vessel are fenestrated. So if you remember back to fenestrated capillaries, this is one of those. So it actually has lots of holes in it. These holes are enough, they're small enough that they allow some things through, but it will prevent cells and platelets from getting through, so they're not that large. So your red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets do not leak out under normal conditions. Now, if there is some kidney damage or extreme high blood pressure, they may get forced out, but those are abnormal conditions, right? Our second layer is the basal lamina of the glomerulus. This will prevent larger proteins that may be located in the plasma, so things like albumin. Albumin would be probably the big one, but other like larger proteins from leaking out. And then there are special cells that will wrap themselves around the glomerulus, and you kind of see that in this image. See that yellow kind of wrapping around the glomerulus? Those are actually cells called podocytes, and they also, like, I don't know, they have these, what they call pedicels. They kind of remind me of like when you put your fingers together, making kind of like that ball-like fist between your two hands. And so by doing that, these kind of like interdigitated fingers will also form some slits, and that will actually stop medium-sized proteins. Small ones will still get through, but the medium-sized ones will not. So we kind of have this, the first layer will allow everything through except cells, which are very large compared to these proteins, and platelets, which, although platelets are tiny, they're still large compared to proteins. The next one will then stop large proteins, and then the next one will stop medium-sized proteins. The only ones that are still getting through are some smaller proteins. There has to be enough blood pressure to create enough force to actually move things out of the glomerulus and not just remain in the bloodstream. So if systemic blood pressure drops too low, like in the case that happens, like if someone's been injured and has had lots of blood loss, if that is allowed to continue, the individual, even though they may survive an injury or blood loss for over a long period of time, they may still end up having some kidney damage, simply because there's not enough blood making its way through the kidneys, which can then cause some necrosis to occur. So it's really important to have high enough blood pressure to be able to push waste out and maintain a healthy kidney. There are some opposing pressures that prevent things from leaking out, and that's simply like anytime there's already fluid in that space, it will make it more difficult to push more fluid out, right? It's just an opposing force. It's very similar to when we talked about the forces moving fluids from a blood vessel into the interstitial space. It's the same kind of concept, but now we're talking about this capsule area. Okay, so again, blood pressure is our main factor. So if our blood pressure drops, our systemic blood pressure drops too low, we cannot adequately filter our bloodstream. We call that filtration the glomerular filtration rate, often abbreviated as GFR, but it's the glomerular filtration rate. And that the definition of that is the amount of filtrate that is formed in all the renal corpuscles, remember that's our Bowman's capsule and glomerulus together, of both kidneys per minute. So that's how, and we don't call it urine yet, we call it filtrate, because as long as we're still making adjustments to it, like in those tubules and the nephron, it is not technically urine. Urine is sort of like the final product after all of the adjustments are made. So it's the amount of filtrate formed in all the renal corpuscles, so all those millions of corpuscles in both kidneys every minute. You don't need to memorize this number, just be aware it's quite a bit. And there's lots of homeostasis that's going to be required to maintain a constant glomerular filtration rate. And actually, we're already at 19 minutes, so I'm going to stop there, and I will pick up on this concept in the next video.